Hi everyone, and we're very excited to have you with us today. Hi Susan.
Hi, how are you?
And before we begin, I would love if we can, if it's possible, to turn on your cameras, because we would love to see you as well. If not, then we will respect your wishes, of course. Hi Olivia, sure, not a problem. Okay, so before we begin, as I said, love to see you all in your cameras if possible. If not, then we will respect your wishes. This call is going to be recorded and it will be uploaded into our YouTube channels. The part that will be recorded is where Chris is presenting and myself, but then any questions after that, so for the Q&A section, it won't be recorded, so that we can respect your wishes and you can feel free to ask as many questions as you like. It is a very it's a safe space, so please do feel comfortable to ask questions. There is there isn't a thing called a silly question. All questions are valid, all questions are important. We are expecting around 33 people to join us today, and we're very excited about that. And the profile of all of you are very different, so I'm sure you will all have something to add. Feel free, if you do have a question, either to put it on the chat or to raise your arm, your virtual hand, and I will be managing the questions for Chris and I to answer accordingly. You have also kindly shared with us your expectations, and we ensured that we do meet these expectations, and Chris has kindly added a couple of examples that will bring the market research to life. There are some people here that I would love to introduce because they are crucial as part of this journey. These people are from Disrupt and from Potentia Insights. They are our partners. They're the ones who helped this research to come to reality. And without them, we wouldn't have had the insights that we do have. And we wouldn't have been able to do a better job at CommUnique as well. I will introduce myself last, for those of you who don't know me, but I would love to start by introducing Chris, and then followed by Freddie from from Potentia Insight. Chris.
Hi everyone, so I'm Chris, I'm co-founder of Disrupt, and my background is very much in all kind of research and insights over the last 20 years, of which sustainability is one of those topics we've covered from many different angles, particularly from a behavioural science angle about how can we help understand the drivers and barriers to change. So very much looking forward to presenting today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And Freddie?
Hi there, yeah, I'm Freddie, I'm a director here at Potentia. And Potentia are kind of an online data collection agency. So we helped Disrupt and CommUnique kind of collect the data for them to analyse and kind of be able to do this report for you guys today. Yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, from CommUnique, there is myself and Rennie. You probably know Rennie better than you know me, with all the emails coming from her. But without her, we wouldn't have been able to be all here. So thank you, Rennie, for this. So I am Jihan Hyde, and I am the founder of CommUnique. We are a consultancy that specializes in stakeholder engagement, specifically when it comes to sustainability. So think about materiality assessment, double materiality assessment, think about scope 3 and supply chain advocacy. So that's what we do. But we also do training and enablement. This is where we train board members and leaders on the latest ESG regulations will impact their operations and their investment choices. We are based in the UK, but we mainly operate in the Middle East, and hence today's session. To give you some context of why we wanted to do this market research, it's because we have clients in the Middle East, but we also have clients in Europe. And we realize that we are trying to engage with the different stakeholders. I am so sorry, can you please all mute yourselves, for those of you who are not muted, because they're just background, thank you. when we were trying to engage with the stakeholders of our clients to bring them on board their sustainability journey, we found that culture plays a massive role in their mindset and in their behavior towards sustainability. But we really couldn't figure out how really culture impacts our behavior. So we wanted to conduct a market research, and the two markets that we chose was the UK and Saudi Arabia. The UK because we're based in the UK, and we have several of our largest clients are in the UK, but also Saudi Arabia because it is the largest GCC population. Plus, 60% of the population in Saudi are below the age of 30. So of course it was very intriguing for us. And plus Saudi is now co-leading the sustainability agenda in the GCC alongside the UAE. And hence we've decided on both these countries. With Disrupt and with Potentia Insights, we've interviewed 1,000 people. I mean, Chris will go into more details about that. But yeah, I have to admit the findings were extremely surprising. Even though I'm extremely familiar with the Saudi market, it was still an eye-opener hearing from these participants. I'm going to open now the floor to Chris to present to us. And again, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask.
Wonderful. Can you see my screen?
We could.
Excellent. So just to build on what Johanna was saying there, we did speak to over 1,000 respondents in both the UK and Saudi. And one of the things we did cover off was everything around people's understanding about sustainability, their attitudes, some of the practices they are doing, and also some of the kind of wider barriers and drivers to change. Now, within the survey, we also used a specific technique that we often use for kind of socially often kind of subjects that people can be quite sensitive about. And so we use an implicit technique based on how quickly people answer on how much they believe or disagree with certain statements. So it allows us to get a measure of the real kind of cultural differences without kind of any kind of social bias creeping in, but also that extent that people might say something versus how much they actually say it and believe it as well. So that process has led to us to discovering some interesting findings as we've gone through. So I won't linger too much on the kind of what we did, but I wanted to kind of highlight what we found. And I think it's fair to say when you look at some of the results, it's quite easy to kind of take a very pessimistic doom and gloom outlook of the data. There's a lot of data that isn't good reading, and there's a lot of concern out there. So you could be forgiven for just basically just keeping this as the title of our presentation, that, you know, it does sometimes feel like the end of the world sometimes. But actually with that, you can also look at the data from an angle and go, there's a lot of potential for change here. And whilst there are some big, serious issues that we need to address, actually, there are ways we can do that and help people on the journey. And people are looking to make that change. We all just need a bit of help and guidance along the way, and investment in the right places as well. So are we doomed? It's a big question, and, you know, it is bleak out there, but it's also, you know, not as terrible as we might think, depending on your attitudes and where you come from. Concern is very high across both the UK and Saudi Arabia. So, you know, in the 70s and 75% UK, people saying they are very concerned about sustainability and the impact on their lives. I think perhaps more concerning or worrying is the fact that there's about a quarter of the population that aren't concerned. And this is where you start to see differences in generations and by culture, that in the UK, that's slightly high amongst the older generations, whereas it's the younger generations in Saudi who are, I suppose, the least concerned or the least understanding of some of the issues that are coming through as well. So whilst overall majority there is concern, there's still a lot of people that you've got to question, actually, should they be more concerned? And actually, how can we help them understand better? The other sense of kind of this impending doom comes from this question where we asked, are we heading for irreversible environmental disaster? So essentially, like, is it stoppable? Is it fixable? And actually, we've got about 2/3 of the population in the UK that agreed to that. And this darker bar in the middle, that implicit agree, 46% of people not only said it, they agreed quickly. So there's a subconscious, they say it and they mean it. So there is under half of Brits feel like, you know, there is an incoming disaster that's inevitable. It is slightly lower in Saudi Arabia, but at an overall agreement, you still have 1 in 2 people agreeing as well. So there is a great sense of actual urgency and the fact that people do feel like this is a very serious issue that is impacting and does need to change. But just like the kind of British weather, obviously today is not a good example given we're in the middle of a heat wave, the outlook is very changeable. It's very pessimistic in the UK when their outlook to sustainability. So 46% of the British population were feeling very pessimistic about the outlook and our ability to address sustainability and change. So that compares to around a quarter who are optimistic. And this is where we start to see some of the real cultural differences come through between markets, where actually in Saudi, the population is a lot more optimistic about the future and a lot more optimistic about change that can come with that as well. So there is a great sense that actually when you're trying to link actions to sustainability, people's outlook is really important, because how people then tend to approach the subject will be determined a lot by this outlook. Part of the reason for the pessimistic outlook is, I mean, when we presented this a few weeks ago, this news was like hot and off the press in The Guardian, that often the news cycle, particularly in the UK, we do get alarmist kind of sustainability headlines that come through a lot. And this is just a prime example of the sea level is going to rise, catastrophic inland migration. So not only is it catastrophic, it's also going to cause migration, which ticks a number of the political boxes in the UK as well, around kind of how to rile up Daily Mail readers as well. But the scenario here is actually a lot of the time the context that people see sustainability is always through this kind of big end of the world scenario. And the problem with that is when you've got a pessimistic mindset in the UK, people look for confirmation bias. They look for pieces of evidence to kind of justify their position, to justify their beliefs, to understand that, to back up the fact that if you already feel that sustainability is out of control and there's nothing we can do to address it, you will always look for the evidence to kind of go, well, actually, that is the case, or why should I bother doing something about it? So confirmation bias can be good when it's framed in the right way, but it can be bad when actually people are automatically looking at it and kind of reinforcing the negative attributes around the topic. The other challenge we've got then is a lot of this does create a lot of apathy, which typically kind of filters through into mainstream culture. So whether you're into 90s REM or more recently Miley Cyrus, a lot of the context around kind of how the topic gets talked about is a lot of, well, you know, it's the end of the world, feel fine, or, you know, let's pretend it's not the end of the world in Miley Cyrus's case. And I think that is important, that the cultural messages that kind of land and the semiotics, we need to kind of move away from that kind of apathy into what can be done to kind of help drive people to change. So if we start looking at some of those uncomfortable realities of sustainability, when we looked at the kind of different markets, actually what was quite common across all was how the kind of the typical laydown of people fell out. So we have this cohort at the bottom left of our chart here who have relatively low attitudes in terms of kind of understanding and kind of attitudes to addressing sustainability versus the amount of behaviours they are doing. So these do nothing is 6%, 9% in Saudi. They're the ones that are doing something, they kind of recognise it's important, but they're also kind of the denialists or don't believe it's high priority. You've then got your minimalists who, again, a relatively small cohort, but still, you know, 1 in 10. They are the people that believe in sustainability and addressing it, but are doing probably the bare minimum that society kind of expects. So that might be, you know, putting out their recycling on a Monday, or kind of helping do those little bits of wider established behaviour. But for the majority, you end up with these kind of this cohort. This one right at the top right, who are really active and trying to do their bit and engaging, buying electric vehicles, trying to take on the latest sustainability initiative into their lives. They recognise it's important. But this vast majority that we've termed the muddled middle majority, these are the people where I think the tipping point is really key to understand the dynamic between they're doing what they can now, they are doing their recycling, they are trying to preserve energy and water, they care, but they are stuck. They are stuck because they don't know what to do, they don't quite know what is best practice and what is the correct guidance, and actually a lot of the kind of information they're absorbing and the messaging feels confused. So they're stuck in the middle, and they need some help to kind of drive that change as well. So taking a step back as well, it's important to remember that when we talk about sustainability, one of the challenges we have with sustainability is that it often just gets badged up really quickly into it's all about resource conservation, it's all about environmental protection. So you might get conjured up images of rainforests, all those kind of things. People default to that kind of big overarching picture of it's all about kind of the very global warming. It is about kind of how we utilize kind of materials and a lot of that. But we have to remember as well that sustainability is broader than that. It actually is about economic development, it is about future generations, it's about sustainable social equality into that as well. And those understandings aren't necessarily thought about from a sustainability badge because everyone defaults to almost the kind of the greenhouse kind of environmental conservation as part of that badge as well. So one of the challenges we have here is to get people to think beyond just some of those elements that are still important, but also think about addressing sustainability from some of these wider issues as well, where again, when it comes to help creating change, there's a lot of power that comes from people wanting to protect for future generations. Social equality arguably never been more important, even though has come on a lot in the past 50 years, 100 years. The other big challenge in all of this is we talk about sustainability, and the world is a complicated chain of lots of different kind of elements. So the fact that very few people will ever really understand the food production process, the fact that in a global economy, so many things are interlinked, although arguably we are, thanks to Donald Trump, moving to a probably more resource centralized worldview in a lot of markets. Actually, a lot of people don't necessarily understand the kind of global commerce, all the areas that link together. So at best, we've got probably over a quarter of people in the UK say they have a reasonable, good understanding about all these aspects of waste management, climate change. In Saudi, actually, there's a higher claimed understanding across all of these, particularly in things like water conservation, where obviously it's more naturally important from a local market. But the key thing here is there's a huge point of the population that kind of sit in this reasonable little understanding. Now, obviously, education is key because the more people know about these topics, they know then how to kind of act and do their part. But the challenge here is we don't always have time to educate people on all of these issues, given they're all really complicated aspects of a kind of global society. So whilst people do need to understand more, they need to understand why they're being asked to change or the need for change. Otherwise, it can too quickly kind of get dismissed and kind of, we get into arguments about wokeism and things like that, where actually we can't afford as a planet, as a society, to not think about these issues, but we can't afford either to spend huge amounts of time educating people as well. So we still need to do the role of education, but it's how can we help people get the right information they need quickly. And with that, one of the big challenges I think we've seen is who are the real kind of role models and inspirational figures? And this is, this might be my first question for the chat. So if you have the chat function ready and going, because I will need your input in a minute. If anyone can actually name anyone that actually they would consider an inspirational role model for kind of sustainability.
Are you asking us that now?
Yeah, throw it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
and then we can come back to it. And so I'm going to play a little game with you in a second. One for Greta Thunberg already. Well, while you're thinking of that, I'm going to play a little game, which I've called the 4Ds of sustainability. So we did ask this question to everyone who answered our survey. So I've taken the UK answers. So out of 500 people, we've coded up how many people then said a different name. So I've just picked 4 random things beginning with the letter D, things or people. And I'm going to see if anyone's good at kind of guessing how many people might have said David Beckham as a role model for sustainability. So you can do this as a percentage or as a figure out of 500.
Yeah, the David Beckham was a surprise.
Let's get my notes up. Oh, we've got 10%, 0%, 10, hopefully less than 5%. Well, yes, you're all right, it is less than 5%. 2%, that is pretty close. I have 2 mentions of David Beckham in the whole of my sample. So here's a nice one that, wow, is it a nice easy one? How many people said Sir David Attenborough? So for those of you based out in the Middle East, David Attenborough is obviously a very big public figure in the UK, very much associated with sustainability through his documentaries. Well, big number there, 60%.
Well done, Olivia.
80, 30%. Oh, you're all going quite big. This probably is a surprise then, that actually, again, of all the people we spoke to, he was actually higher than David Beckham, so some reassurance in that, but not by much. We only had 4 mentions of David Attenborough in all of our survey, which you would have thought would have been much higher, but actually, again, comes down to some of the kind of confusion. All right, my final one, penultimate one, Donald Trump. Do you think, how many people were going to mention Donald Trump?
And by the way, we never prompted these individuals. We just asked, who do you think would be a role model?
So this is a complete open end that anyone can put any name that they wanted. Oh, you know what? I feel like you're getting the hang of my game now, actually. So yeah, Olivia Fina, you're right. Actually, there was one person who mentioned Donald Trump. So again, I don't know whether that surprises you that that's one too many, or actually, you know what? He is a game changer. He does make things change. But the biggest D of all. Does anyone want to guess what the biggest D would be? What are you thinking? Can you shoehorn Greta Thunberg in there somewhere? It's not. I'll put you out of your misery. Is don't know. And this says a lot about kind of actually the whole dynamic of most people, whilst, you know, Donald Trump isn't coming to mind, was good. David Attenborough is coming around to some. Greta Thunberg was mentioned by a few, but not a lot of people. It kind of really goes to show that there's gaps here that people don't know who to turn to. Actually, of the kind of key things people said, so local councils did come through, government, politicians, family and friends. 2% of people actually said themselves in the mix as well. So there is a role for actually who are those role models out there? Who are the people that can genuinely influence and help people embrace sustainability as a topic? So I think this kind of sums up the fact that, you know, everyone knows there's a role for people to get involved, but they also are looking for people to go, well, who can influence them? Who can actually kind of help them on that journey for that muddled middle majority? And this is where people do need help. But people also have to take responsibility for themselves. In Saudi, actually, that kind of self-responsibility is higher. And that belief that actually that they can have a bigger impact on their actions as a result is higher. So again, it's like empowering people in order to do their bit. But there is this still element of small but strong-minded, implicit group who do still think it's somebody else's problem. So they do need those kind of role models, that inspiration. And the government and the local authorities have a key part in that. But one of the things we were debating previously was actually, can the local government, is there a better way to share information to help people on that journey? A lot of recycling figures get published, but how many of you actually know what your recycling rate is in your local area and whether it's improving or going down? And it's information like that that actually could be powerful kind of motivators to drive change. So whilst individuals are important, it's also important for businesses and organizations to also do their part. Here we've got this agreement, businesses should do more to tackle sustainability. 81% agreement, 85% agreement in the UK. Implicit agreement is very high on that. So actually there is a strong sense that businesses have to play their part. They can't hide behind it, and they shouldn't be greenwashing either, but they need to be part of this process to drive change. This data on the right, you'll see a bit more of a gap between the claimed and the implicit. That's where people kind of think some of the kind of measurement around sustainability and tracking, there's a sense that people think it's important, but also implicitly it's quite low agreement. In fact, where people don't really know, like figures aren't necessarily a reassurance for people alone. So having more reporting isn't necessarily the answer. People kind of expect it, but they kind of want to know what really is going to drive change, which they just expect and need to trust businesses to be doing their part. So when it comes to actually thinking about how do you drive that change, probably wouldn't surprise you that the biggest barriers to change are typically cost and the fact that people don't necessarily recognise that the help from the authorities in the UK, they're just unsure of the right choices, or actually they don't trust the people, the politicians, the organisations driving the change as well. So particularly when a topic does become politicised, it can become tricky. Obviously UK, the government, the opposition party seems to be debating whether sustainability and net zero is the right kind of tactic at the moment, even though that's been the government policy for the last 20 so years. So there is a lot of kind of change which filters down to the public where they don't necessarily then know who to believe or how to kind of go about that change. In Saudi, actually the dynamic is different because they're much more open to change as a population. And actually here we see more people say they're just unsure of the right choices, or even the fact that it's too hard to make the change or asking for change to come too soon. So that kind of rate of change is a key factor that people do need to understand, that it will take time to kind of adopt behaviour, but obviously you need to kind of give them a reason to adopt more quickly. And that can be uncomfortable for many as well. So kind of taking people through that journey is quite important. So how can we drive some of the kind of positive aspects of change? I mentioned the fact that there's not a lot of kind of inspirational figures around the subject. And then the other aspect of that is we've got to think, well, how do people consume news? How do they consume content around sustainability? So a lot of that comes from the fact that in the UK, the top sources of learning or understanding sustainability issues comes from the news. It comes from David Attenborough and documentaries. Then it's social media, and then it's environmental organisations and chats with friends and family. Kind of government sources are kind of lower down the list here. In Saudi, obviously remember that it's a younger skewed population. Social media is the top channel that people are consuming news and content around sustainability. I suppose the challenge with social media is obviously it can be quite a wild west out there in terms of messaging, in terms of what gets pushed, in terms of narratives, in terms of user generated content as well. So there can be a tricky balance between what is kind of factual information, what is proper knowledgeable educational kind of type content versus what might just be people putting their own opinions out. So there is a dynamic as to social media should be a great power for good, but you've got to be making sure that those trusted sources kind of out there spoken about around the topic. Interestingly, in Saudi, they are government kind of comes through a lot more strongly, as does kind of education, as well as kind of key sources of kind of news and topics. So again, trusted sources that people do believe and do act upon that advice as well. So going back to one of my earlier charts when I said that Brits are more pessimistic and Saudis are more optimistic, the reason this is really important is if you look at pessimists and you look at optimists, and then you say how many people are actually willing to make changes to live more sustainably, pessimists are essentially 2 times less likely than optimists to be open to making that change. So if you have an optimistic mindset, you are much more likely to embrace the idea of change through sustainability and all of those kind of dynamics that come with it. So to quote Monty Python's Life of Brian, always look on the bright side of life. I mean, if we just take the pessimistic doom and gloom outlook and that confirmation bias, the problem is we're kind of just keeping people kind of, I suppose, level on the status quo. We're not going to try and do more. Whereas we give people a positive reason to believe that they can exact change, they're more likely to embrace and adopt some of those changeable behaviours as well. So this is very important from a sustainability point of view of actually thinking about the positive news and thinking about driving society forward, that yes, you can scare people with the doomsday scenarios, but equally, if you want to drive change, you've got to drive the positivity around that. And people will change for the right reasons. People do want to be responsible citizens. They do want to help the future generations, and they want to lead by example, and they do want a fair and equitable society. So actually people are driven by social good across markets. So again, just tapping into that kind of wider social sense of society and that importance can be a powerful motivator. But what we found really interesting from this research is that kind of the power of your neighbours and society, and kind of what people are you more likely to act based on your own motivations, or more likely to act because people on your street are doing something versus because everyone else in the country is doing something. So in Saudi, we asked the question, how seriously do people perceive sustainability is taken? So in my own household, 80% of the population agreed to say, actually, we take it very seriously in my own household. And then we said, well, actually, how about the rest of the country? And you see that people perceive the rest of the country takes sustainability more seriously. So there is a sense that wider society is doing more. So from an individual perspective, there is a motivation for you to keep up and do more to reflect the societal expectation. The UK is the opposite way around. The fact that people perceive that they are doing their own kind of bit for sustainability, for social good. Again, similar, 80% agree, but much lower sense that the rest of the country is doing their part. And so actually, when it comes to thinking about that motivation of how are you going to kind of drive people, if you think you are doing more than your neighbours, or you are doing more than your kind of the people in the county next door, it's not necessarily going to be a motivator. It's actually going to be more of a driver of the status quo than growth in terms of sustainability behaviour. So I think we do have to think about addressing that optimism bias and filtering through into how we can kind of drive people to make it seem like, or feel like, people have got to do more to catch up with the rest of society. Unsurprisingly, when it comes to actually driving change, making it easy is, funnily enough, going to be the bit that will drive a lot more kind of change. And the way people say that they want to kind of to enact that change, they do want more, better quality, more reliable information. They do want more kind of convenient options for sustainable behaviours, whether that is doing their bit for recycling, or whether that is investing in electric vehicles and being able to kind of charge them and have that infrastructure in place will help drive the convenience. Obviously, it helps if you have financial incentives, like a subsidy on electric vehicles, but when that gets taken away, that does have a big impact. And then community initiatives, power of community can be very important. The fact that people talked about their local councils as an influencer, it's very an interesting dynamic to think, well, how can we tap more into those community angles? So I suppose my final kind of thoughts on all this as well is sometimes you do need disruption, and a good kind of disruption. And I would say that because I've called my agency Disrupt, but actually a lot of the people we spoke to did recognize the fact that sustainability does require diverse perspectives and a mixture of opinions and ideas. And often that is where that innovation and those ideas start coming through as well. So what I quite like is some examples here. So in the UK, in London, obviously a lot of you will be probably very familiar with the Boris bikes back in 2010 when it first launched, which was in planning for many years, from about 2006. But actually the roots of that idea came much earlier on. So even now, like London is nothing but kind of bikes on every corner and scooters. The transformation has been huge in that kind of time. But actually, if you go back, you can trace the origin of that to actual 1965 in Amsterdam, where there was a kind of counterculture movement where a group just basically set up a small fleet of white bikes around Amsterdam that were enabling people to kind of transport easily. So that whole idea kind of sparked a wider idea into kind of existence, and that idea into the fact that, you know, we now see kind of these bikes in most big cities all around the kind of world. The other one here might be a company that maybe some of you have heard of, some of you might imagine, a lot of you won't have done. Iris are a really fascinating Saudi agri-tech company. And one of the things they've done in recent years is developed a range of technology that allows crops to grow in extreme climate. So in the deserts in Saudi, using salt water and heat to kind of help that kind of growing, kind of help grow crops essentially in very extreme conditions. So a great idea that's driven innovation into the fact that working with the kind of extremes of the climate to go, how can we actually adapt and use that more effectively, more efficiently and smartly. The other one I discovered recently as well is a fascinating topic, which was a chap age 31 in India, in Gujarat, actually after an earthquake discovered that his whole family home was basically destroyed. It was just a pile of smashed clay pots in the courtyard, of which clay pots have been traditionally used to kind of as a, I suppose, cooling refrigerator for food. And actually from that, he started going about developing his own way to say, well, how can he produce a natural clay refrigerator that can be used in extreme heat and can be used cost effectively without any mains, without any of the technology. And it was this kind of really smart kind of a MITI-cool fridge that could be used across very extreme conditions to keep food cool. Even down to in the lovely warm West Wales somewhere, but again, scientists have discovered that flooded coal mines, the water temperature in coal mines is actually a steady 5-10 degrees warmer than above surface. So actually, by tapping into that temperature, the water in flooded coal mines, they can use it as a heating scheme to kind of, again, use natural resources, use that in a smart way without then having to essentially use coal-powered stations and other sources to kind of help drive that kind of heating that was needed. So just thinking slightly differently, and even from a disrupting from a retailer's perspective, everyone can do their part. Obviously, as we are well approaching kind of festival season in the UK, actually there's so many people just buy disposable tents, even though they're not disposable tents, they get left at festival sites. So again, Decathlon is trying to do their bit to go, well, actually, if you bring your tent back, we'll refund you. Because a lot of the time, even though a lot of tents do say they get reused and given to other sources, I saw another new article the other day that said a lot of the time they do just still end up in landfill as well. So coming up with creative, disruptive ways to tackle the topics and drive kind of people to think a bit differently, I think is going to be really important as well. So with that, hopefully we're leaving you with some interesting thoughts about how to tackle the topic.
If you do have any more questions for Chris, for Freddie or myself, please do get in touch. We are all CC'd in the same emails. Do get in touch with each other and let's collaborate. That's for sure. Thank you once again. Thanks for joining.